McIvor and Co-ops and Mutuals Wales. And to take a Euro football analogy, I think, folks, it's a game of two halves. I think we've had an exciting first half. I think there's been a few goals, and I anticipate a few more close skirmishes in the second half. Probably won't end in penalties, but I think the crowd will be cheering from the sidelines as we hear some exciting contributions. So straight over to the Jeremy Miles, the Minister for Education and the Welsh Language, Labour and Co-op member of the Senedd. I'll hand over to him now. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm in awe of your ability to extend the metaphor in the way that you did. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to match that. But really delighted to be chairing this session, which is going to look at how we raise the profile of Robert Owen and co-ops and mutuals in Wales, and how we encourage engagement with the sector in all aspects of life. And I think particularly into perhaps given my ministerial responsibilities, in hearing how we might do that in the context of education, which Owen had some incredibly progressive things to say about. And I think in many ways that move to a more kind of child-centered education policy is one that which has inspired our education journey in Wales during the period of devolution. So I think there are some very interesting lessons for us from his work. I'm one of the co-op party members of the Senedd, along with Mick and a very large number of others, actually. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of, and I'm sure Mick is as well, is how the co-op principles and the work of the co-op movement has achieved such a voice in the work of Senedd, and I would say the government as well. And I think that is that can be seen in the kind of policy initiatives that we've developed over the years. And I think the growing presence of co-op members in the Senedd will support that to continue even further and even stronger into the future. But you didn't come to hear me speak, you came to hear our very illustrious panel, and we have three contributors, each of whom are going to give us their reflections on this area before we then open the discussion to the floor. So please do think about the questions and points that you would like to make during the remarks which each of our speakers is going to give. We have Liz Mclvor, who manages the Co-operative Heritage Trust, which supports the public to have access to the rich archive and material collections, and to safeguard the heritage assets of the co-op movement in the UK. Liz, as you will see from the short biographies in your paper today, has a background in museums management and has worked with some of the leading museums in the UK. Sian Williams is the head of special collections and librarian for the South Wales Miners Library, which is at Swansea University, as colleagues will know. And Sian is responsible as well for the development of the Richard Burton archives, the Miners Library, Rare Books and History of Computing collection, and the art collection as well at Swansea University, and has a significant track record in community and collaborative projects in this space, and perhaps very directly related to this discussion, curated an exhibition on Robert Owen's legacies about 10 years ago, I think. Dr. Sarah Vicari is a researcher in the space of cooperatives and their role in sustainable development, sustainable human development, brings an international perspective to the discussion today, was co-founder, as I'm sure some colleagues will know, of Around the World Co-op, and has travelled extensively internationally, documenting the work of and the innovations of cooperatives in different parts of the world. So a rich tapestry of influences and experiences to share this morning. And I'll ask, please, if Liz, whether you would kick us off.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm happy to do that. Thank you for the introduction. I have a few slides, so I'm going to be sharing my screen with you. There we go. So you should be able to see that, hopefully. So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm looking at, kind of Owen's legacy and the co-op movement in Wales relating to our collection, what we hold at the Cooperative Archive, which, as you said, is part of the Co-operative Heritage Trust. And the trust was formed in 2007, so we're still quite a new organisation, relatively, as an independent charity to bring collections together in the face of possible loss. And Owen's correspondence forms part of that collection. It was originally collected by George Jacob Holyoake, who became known later as the first cooperative historian. And it was deposited with his own writings after his death with the Cooperative Union based in Manchester. So what I want to really look at is Welsh records partly in this, and what I've called the gap of nations, because I think that in the way that we tell the cooperative story, we don't always tell it, if you like, from that perspective, from the perspective of having different nation identities. And that's, of course, no doubt partly because of the cooperative movement's ethos in looking at the whole in a holistic approach, which is, of course, what Robert Owen was an exponent of. But I'm interested in Welsh records. I want to make the link between Owen and the cooperative movement. It's not always the easiest thing to do. And trying to do a Welsh cooperative history is quite challenging for various reasons. But we're keen to explore ways of doing that and ways of engaging new audiences. So particularly as we look forward to collecting new material in the future to tell the whole co-op story. So I'm going to start with, we talked about Owen as an influencer, but there are other influences and influencers at the time. He's not the only one, of course. Dr. William King, who's on this slide here, also wrote about the establishment of effectively cooperative societies. And although he had a very different take on it to Owen, they were both social influences of their time through what they said and what they wrote and how people responded to that. Some of the Rochdale pioneers themselves were described as Owenites before establishing their cooperative. And I'd hoped today to be talking to you from their original cooperative store in Rochdale, but due to coronavirus, which is why I'm not there and I'm at home, but it's partly due to the success of the retail provision of the retail model that there's a disconnect in the minds of people when it comes to Robert Owen and what they see as the cooperative movement now. That there is still a tendency amongst the wider public who maybe don't know very much about Robert Owen or the cooperative movement to see them as disconnected, as cooperatives being about making money or being about retail, being about provision of services, rather than a cultural understanding. He's a better known figure, Robert Owen, in other places. For example, he's particularly well known in Japan and in the USA, partly because of the New Harmony model, but also because of the understanding about him being a father of the cooperative movement in the agricultural sector. So he's less well known in Mid Wales, where he came from. And of course, this idea of his writings, I think, which Chris has already talked about this morning, being around how change can take place in a strict class hierarchy in Britain, and how ideas that Owen had might be used in a more practical framework by other people. And of course, we know that there were inconsistencies with the way that Owen lived and the relationships he had, and of course those natural allies he might have had at the time didn't always see things the same way that he did. But of course that's true of modern influences as well, whether they're social media, whether they're football players, that there are a lot of negative and critical voices. So I know that obviously that is something that Owen would have had to cope with in his lifetime, and that's understandable because you can never take everybody on board with you. But really, I suppose, looking at the message, the idea of knowledge and union, taking that from the cooperator, being powerful, that the sharing of ideas gives power. By the time Robert Owen became involved at New Lanark, to make a comparison between New Lanark and Manchester, where of course a lot of Owen's experience was gained, the regions are similar in Owen's time as trade, production and distribution hubs. So they're hubs of power as well. And I suppose what he's faced with in New Lanark, as well as in Manchester, is a problem directly related to social and economic disruption. So we might be tempted, if we were going to transplant our modern selves back into the early 1800s, to call that a new normal, to use current parlance. Workers in both places, in Manchester and New Lanark, are, if you like, the first generation to spend their whole working lives in purpose-built factories and purpose-built new communities outside the traditional, village context, rural context. And that cultural shift, it categorises what we now understand to be the industrial age. It's a change in behaviours that happens so quickly that people don't know how to fully respond to them, and it creates not only problems but also new solutions and new ways of resolving some of these problems. It's very difficult, of course, to get other industrialists, other people to accept ideas like performance management, the rights of workers, the rights of the person, the need for education, environmentalism. In places like Manchester and in Glasgow, never mind places like rural Wales. So it's not surprising in some ways that Owen's message or Owen's legacy is less understood, perhaps, in Wales. And I've used this slide because I want to talk a little bit about, if you like, about co-ops in Wales, sort of leading on from Owen. George Hawkins wrote an essay in 1892 about cooperation in South Wales, and I've not shared a picture of the essay because it's very, very boring. There are no pictures in it. But he was the chair of CWS's London branch, the Cooperative Wholesale Society, and effectively the essay is a bit of a pressure point and a love letter to CWS and to federation and unionisation. And in it, he's quite controversially, he accuses South Welsh cooperative managers of not being very cooperative. And he says things like that they're allowing credit lines, which is not a cooperative practice, and that individual managers are trying to effectively be capitalists by using their influence to increase their means beyond their salaries. That's the words that he uses. And what he says in this essay is he pleads for these South Welsh cooperators to put their house in order. They're the words he uses, and to be better cooperators. And this is, let's not forget, a message from England. It's not a message from Wales or a message to Welsh people. And the more subtle take on it today might be, the strapline of International Cooperatives Day, which is today, rebuild better together. How better to work together for mutual benefit without losing your own sense of identity or the way that you do things. But Hawkins's text is much more hard-hitting than that, much less subtle. And what he puts it down to is he says that around £300,000 is lost through poor cooperation, which could be used for the benefit of local people in charity or educational opportunities. So he's basing that on Glamorgan cooperative, sort of the cooperative surplus, if you like. He's saying that in cooperatives in Glamorgan, there's over £500,000 is available through those cooperatives. So they're a really powerful force, potentially, compared to in Carmarthenshire, only netting about £3,000 that year. And he doesn't talk about the difference in experience between South Wales and North Wales. What he's trying to do is harness the power of, if you like, the spending power, the power of dividend of the South Welsh communities, much more heavily populated, more industrialised, to come into the union, to be part of the cooperative union, to be part of the national approach to the movement. So that's what that essay is really about. But that, what it shows you is that there is a difference in the Welsh experience at the time in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The way cooperative societies work, what happens to them is different. And particularly where in rural Wales and mid Wales, you know, there's a strong sort of ethos around community cooperatives, particularly in remote places, where membership offers more than just a dividend. It offers, you know, opportunity to do other things. And it's in a similar demographic to what you might see in rural parts of Scotland, where those independent societies hang on for a really long time before becoming merged with cooperative retail society and eventually the CWS, which is now the cooperative group. Until the 1940s, a great shift away from land-based employment. That was, you know, a fairly sort of stable setup. But when farming could no longer support large populations and retail habits and social habits and economic habits changed, that's when you see a big shift nationally, all over the country, away from cooperative membership. And in those unliquidated societies, particularly in North Wales, what you now see is that those are cooperative group premises, often in the same, you know, the original society buildings. And I think there's a tendency when we're trying to tell the story of always focusing on the bigger part of that story, on the, if you like, the, you know, the sort of major partners, on effectively cooperative group, because those are the most visible signs. So in placement of co-op stores in North Wales, you now see in places like Ruthin or Llanrwst, Bangor, Machynlleth, Llanfairpwllgwyngyll. I'm not going to say the whole word, my pronunciation won't be great, but those are the places that still have, if you like, at the centre of community, the cooperative group, but would originally have had a very rich individual and localised society and membership base. So, you know, what does that say for cooperative identity in Wales? You know, and the visibility of heritage, because we've got Robert Owen, but he's better known elsewhere. So how could we sort of connect that? How can we sort of go back to the roots of co-op identity and history and celebrate it, bearing in mind it's so invisible in some cases? I just wanted to share this photograph from a cooperative survey that was undertaken in the early 20th century, and this picture of Cefn Mawr near Wrexham, the new premises in 1901. And I think until very recently it was called the Wheat Sheaf Workshops. It was used for community purposes. But why I wanted to share this picture, and it's a very grainy picture, is because one of the items that we have in our collection is this textile banner, which shows the building when it was newly built, and I think is a really nice way of linking back to the physical heritage to the built environment. And that building, of course, is still at the centre of that district, is still there. It may not be being used for the same purposes, but I think these are the things that can make those connections. So why was that building important to that community? Why did they invest the money in a new and modern premises and modern architecture? And what could it mean for the future? And basically, how can we use our collections to be part of that, to sort of tell that story, and to be meaningful to people in those places now? And I'm just going to use a slightly more contemporary photograph, and it's not very contemporary, it's from the mid-80s, of Tinnewed Community Pub as it was then. It's no longer a community cooperative. Now the pub is still there near Pwllheli. But I wanted to use this because this was an example in the 80s of capturing the new wave of cooperatives, so community cooperatives, worker cooperatives. And why I chose this is because we have seen, particularly recently, an mass exodus from those North and Mid Wales communities of young people with skills and ambition, because they don't have employment or they don't have opportunity, they can't get housing in those communities. So I think that this is still an example of a model that can be used to pivot to new markets. It's still a useful model. It's still something that, you know, perhaps is a solution when a community needs to be self-reliant, needs to provide its own services. So community pubs aren't a new idea, but there are lots and lots of ways in which the cooperative model, and if you like, Owen's ideas about making a community a more sustainable place, especially for young people, and how to harness education as part of that. So I think that there is a future for that, but what we need to do is to fill in the gap that people, especially young people, don't see this, don't understand this, and don't see the sort of wealth, if you like, of the last 2 centuries of cooperative practice, particularly in Wales. So that's a gap we need to fill. I'd like to stop sharing at this stage, and yeah, it's just some ideas basically. But I'm gonna pose a question to the floor. We want to be able to use our collections, not just Owen's correspondence, but all of our collections and the ones that we will continue to build on, to work together in that kind of loose mutual culture that Wales is so famous for, to try to sort of do our part in filling in that gap of education and cooperative culture. So I'm going to leave the question, how can we do that more effectively in partnership with other organisations? Thank you.
Liz, thank you very much for that. And thank you also for devising the question for us to discuss later, which is very helpful. I'm really keen that we come back to that idea of how we can use our experiences and our heritage, which illustrates that, to stimulate and re-inspire people on the community level, cooperative. I think we can come back to that in the discussion, but thank you for a really interesting discussion there.